Trump's doing this because he knows I'll beat him like a drum. And he's using the abuse of power and every element of the presidency to try to do something to smear me. Everybody looked at this, and everybody's looked at it and said there's nothing there. I know what I'm up against. A serial abuser. That's what this guy is. He abuses power everywhere he can. If he sees any threat to his staying in power, he'll do whatever he has to do. But this crosses the line. This crossed the line.
If there was any doubt on Friday about how forcefully Joe Biden was willing to defend himself, we've certainly got an answer now. Team Biden is ready for a political fight. And no matter what happens in the coming days and weeks, it's already clear this is a flashpoint in the 2020 election. Mayor Pete Buttigieg spoke about it yesterday.
Do you think that there are legitimate questions or scrutiny that people should be paying into potential conflicts of interest between the former vice president and his son and his work overseas?
I've not seen any evidence of that, and I think it's also taking our eye off the ball of just a really shocking reality, or a shocking allegation, let's say that. We have the American president whose most shameful backstory has to do with interference in 2016, in the middle of what appears to be soliciting interference in 2020. It's just, even with this presidency, it's something that is hard to picture. And we can't allow that to do what they want it to be, which is to twist it into something that somehow benefits them.
Mayor Pete Buttigieg is in Iowa right now in the middle of a 4-day bus tour. But while he condemned the president, he didn't go as far as Elizabeth Warren did, who says Congress is complicit for failing to act.
Congress failed to act, and now Donald Trump has shown that he believes he is above the law. He has solicited another foreign government to attack our election system. It is time for us to call out this illegal behavior and start impeachment proceedings right now.
And Mayor Pete Buttigieg is in Decatur, Iowa, and joins us now. Thank you so much for spending some time with us.
Good to be with you.
Would you go so far today as Elizabeth Warren did? Do you see this as a green light to Donald Trump to continue to act in a lawless manner if Congress doesn't move toward impeachment proceedings?
I think he's going to act in a lawless manner no matter what. Look, he's made it clear that he deserves to be impeached. We're also in a reality where the Senate Republicans have completely lost touch with their conscience. I support the House in taking on impeachment proceedings. I also think that the only real resolution to this will be defeating this president and his enablers in the congressional Republican caucuses. Look, what's going on here is shocking. The president of the United States confessed to official misconduct, and nothing appears to be changing around that. We also got to be able to do two things at once. I just walked around the town of Decatur with the mayor here. They're concerned about making sure that their community can thrive. They're worried about infrastructure. They're worried about keeping their school open. They're interested in health care. And we've got to make sure that we deal with this president and also deny him his power to constantly change the subject from the other things that we are delivering on or proposing to deliver on that he just won't, because life in American communities is not getting any better under this president. He hasn't kept any of his promises other than the one about the corporate tax cut. And we've got to demonstrate a better way. And assuming that Senate Republicans won't do their duty in the event of an impeachment, we've got to defeat both them and him.
But, Mr. Mayor, with all due respect, is your job of defeating him made easier or harder when he simply becomes more emboldened? We only know about his request to the leader of Ukraine to help him defeat Joe Biden, should that be the eventual nominee. I'm sure you're hoping that's not how the Democratic primary ends up. But I mean, is your job of defeating him at the ballot box made easier or harder if the Democrats impeach or don't impeach? What's your political calculation on the Democrats proceeding with impeachment? Is it good for you or bad for you?
Well, I'm not getting any questions about it here in Iowa, at least not from voters. It's not that people don't care. It's that people are also focused on what's happening in their own lives. And I think our job of defeating this president depends on having a good candidate with a great vision. In addition to calling out presidential wrongdoing, it's explaining how everyday life is going to get better. I think that the House should act. I also think that the House's actions will not have any effect on the conduct of this president. The only way to deal with it, given the Senate being where it is, and they can do whatever they feel is right in the House, I think they should proceed. But the only thing that's really going to make a difference is for Senate Republicans to experience a loss of power as a consequence of them betraying their own values by being on board with this president.
I worked for Senator John McCain, and I can't help but see a little sort of homage to his Straight Talk Express and the bus tour you're undertaking. What is your strategic objective in being on a bus, being more accessible to reporters than perhaps some of your Democratic opponents are? And what are you hoping to achieve through this bus tour?
Well, we want to demonstrate our values around openness and authenticity. One thing, even though he's from a different party, that I admired about Senator McCain was that he was willing to provide that kind of access and talk to journalists about whatever the most pressing issues of the day were. As we travel between these different communities, I've got an opportunity to speak with reporters and speak directly with people who are sending in ideas and questions from around the country about how this campaign is going to affect them and about what it is we're seeing on the ground. I think it brings us all a little closer to reality. And it also demonstrates that a candidate has the qualities that I'm going to need as president, which is the ability to have open, frank, frequent, and honest conversations with the press about where this campaign and eventually where this country is headed.
Where this country is headed, it would seem that you think is toward really no recourse over this president. You suggested that he'll act however he's going to act, regardless of whatever remedies Congress applies. It also is apparent from Democratic primary polling that voters are hungry for the kinds of full frontal attacks that Joe Biden launched on Donald Trump in his video where he took on the president's conduct in Charlottesville. How willing and eager are you to make Trump front and center in your candidacy?
I don't have any problem confronting this president, but I also think that the more we're talking about him, the less we're talking about us. And it would be a tremendous gift to Trump to make this election all about him. No question, we're going to call out his lies. We're going to confront his wrongdoing. We're not going to lose sight of the questions that voters are asking about how their lives are going to get different. The questions I'm getting are you going to keep my kids safe in school? Are you going to see to it that the economy is going to grow in a way that earnings actually get to us in our families? What are you going to do about making sure that there is health care available to all of us and that a health care provider stays open in this community? These are the things that are going to affect people's lives. The most egregious failure of this president, in addition to the criminal behavior, the deception, the racism, and all his other wrongdoing, is the fact that he has done nothing to make our country actually better. Nothing on wages, nothing on family leave, nothing positive on health care, nothing to actually resolve the issue of immigration, nothing on infrastructure, despite that deal that he touted. That matters too. And we should not allow this president the gift of getting us arguing about whatever outrageous tweet he just sent at the expense of making sure that we are competing on the turf that we will always win on, which is what the American people agree with us on, which is their actual lives from health care to wages to safety.
Mayor Pete, I spent more time on the campaign trail working on campaigns than I've spent on television. I asked this question of everybody. What are we missing here in the national media that you're seeing on the campaign trail? And how important is Iowa to your candidacy? Is it must win, top three? Where do you put Iowa for you?
Crucial for us to do well in Iowa. It's a place where we can demonstrate the ability to win elections. We can show the sort of ground game that we've built now that helps us have, for example, such a great showing at the steak fry that reporters are saying we won the steak fry, so to speak. That's also a show of organizational strength that will be needed in terms of the mechanics of what it takes to organize your supporters to win on caucus night. So Iowa is very much a key part of our pathway to the nomination. In terms of what's getting missed in the coverage, there's a lot of coverage asking tough and important questions, but to me, it still seems very Washington-oriented. A lot of people here aren't asking me about the latest ups and downs of the dynamics among the House Democrats or what's going on with proceedings. They want to know how their lives are going to be improved or worsened by the decisions that are being made in those big white buildings in Washington, D.C. And we must make sure we could keep our eye on that, because that also happens to be winning turf for us as Democrats. The American people are already with us on every major issue affecting this country. That's why we got to make sure that we don't get off arguing about Greenland when we could be talking about how to make sure the economy works for us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.